NDIA must be made aware that more support is being provided than there's funding. Again, this is about protecting the provider, because in these situations, they're the ones that are absorbing all the risk here, because the ultimate outcome will be providing support with zero funding. And this is where providers can very easily get into a position where you're losing 70, 150, 200,000 plus for a house because you're providing support and there's zero funding to support it.
So it sounds like over-servicing happens because of providing too much support because the participant has increasing needs. And so the risk there is really around losing money on that participant because you might not be getting that funding back. Am I right?
Correct. And taking the necessary steps around this, because in a lot of cases we're talking about there is a need for the additional support being provided.
Every SIL provider knows the challenges: compliance, rosters, claims. But what if you could work smarter, grow faster, and make a bigger impact? Welcome to SILosophy, where we have real conversations about what it takes to succeed in supported independent living. This podcast is powered by Tania Gomez Consulting and Resolv. Let's get into it.
Welcome to SILosophy. Today I'm joined by Josh Pix from Resolv to talk about service agreements that work. Welcome back, Josh.
Thank you very much, Tania.
So nice to have you here. Before we jump into it, can you give us a brief overview of what Resolv do and your experience in the SIL space?
Sure. So as Resolv, we've been here for 18 months now. Our experience in the disability space for two of our founders has been the last 7 years. Two of us worked for one of the largest disability software providers here in Australia. We worked with a lot of providers of all sizes, and during that time, it was very evident to us that providers were having a lot of difficulty, especially SIL, and in that exposure to SIL providers specifically and the participants at SIL, it was an industry that we started to feel a close affinity with. We joined forces with Adam, the third founder of Resolv. Adam started his career as a support worker in SIL houses about 10 years ago. So we've got a very deep affinity for the SIL space. We know the big impact it can have. And we know SIL providers are not doing it easy. And as a result, we started Resolv. Where we could see we could make a difference was providers are losing significant amounts of money around the rostering and claiming aspect of their business. And so Resolv partners with providers over a long-term period to help them with their rostering and claiming, identifying significant amounts of money that can be pushed back into the business to allow for better outcomes for participants.
Amazing. It's so amazing to hear that there's a service like that for providers, because it's something that is, just dramatically needed in the space. So today we're talking about service agreements. So to begin with, I wanted to talk to you about the risks of having poor service agreements.
Sure. So as part of the work that we do when we create rosters and claiming on an ongoing basis for providers, we also develop the schedules of support. And we normally begin looking at the provider's schedules of support, and we've identified a large number of issues which creates problems for providers. A lot of it is just not having the correct protections in the agreement, as well as the rigor around the decision making that goes into the schedules of support as well. So what we see is providers not being properly protected through their existing schedule of support, and at the same time being party to a number of open agreements or open service agreements, which then exposes the provider to significant risk.
So can you explain what you mean by an open service agreement?
Sure. So any SIL providers listening to this, I think will be nodding their head and knowing they've got at least one or two open agreements in their business right now. So an open agreement is where you've developed a service agreement or schedule of support. You're over servicing on the basis of a conversation with a stakeholder that additional funding will be coming via a change of circumstance or otherwise. And then what happens inevitably, especially now with change of circumstances, is a lot of them are not being approved or being approved at a much lower amount. And when that change of circumstance isn't approved, the funding has exhausted and the provider's left in a position where they're having to continue to provide funding and support. And so an open agreement is where the provider is not completely clear on what is going to happen when the funding is exhausted in a situation of overservicing.
Right. And can you just define what you mean by overservicing?
Sure. So for any given participant, there's a certain amount of funding and support that should be provided that should align with that funding. So overservicing is any situation where a provider is providing more support than what is being funded for.
And in what circumstances might that happen?
So it definitely happens unintentionally, due to breakdowns in processes around the rostering and scheduling team, or lack of communication around how much funding is available. That's one of the classic situations of overservicing. There is intentional overservicing, and there's really two flavors of that. One of the reasons we love this space is that providers will intentionally overservice, and because there's a very specific need or risk to that participant, and they're intentionally willing to absorb the financial impact of that overservicing. So that's definitely one of the flavors. The second is unintentional or forced overservicing, where, back to the open agreement, there has been a verbal agreement around potentially or providing more support than there is funding for, and then that funding being exhausted, and the provider in a situation where they're just left providing support with no claiming for that support being provided.
It sounds like overservicing happens because of providing too much support because the participant has increasing needs. So you need to provide increasing supports without that funding coming through.
Sure.
And so the risk there is really around losing money on that participant because you might not be getting that funding back. Am I right?
Correct. And taking the necessary steps around this, because in a lot of cases we're talking about there is a need for the additional support being provided. Okay, so there's risk to a participant, so therefore we should be providing more support, and that's why you have the change of circumstance process. However, it's essential that every provider, whenever a situation is created where they're going to be providing more support than there's funding available for, that there's a very specific process that they run through to make sure they're protected in each of those situations. And so for each of we actually build it into the schedule of support for our providers. And it's really, there's 6 essential steps to the process that needs to be in there for every single circumstance where you are intentionally providing more support than is being funded for. The very first thing that needs to happen is a written request from the guardian and the support coordinator requesting for more support than funding is available. The reason this first step is so important is because this situation is not just the responsibility for the provider, it's a shared responsibility between all parties. And what happens so often in these situations is that everyone just looks to the provider to solve everybody's problems and provide all the support out of pocket, which isn't fair to the other participants within the other houses. So the very first step is to get that written request from the stakeholders and the support coordinator, sorry, acknowledging that they are requesting for more support to be provided. The second part of the process is a risk assessment um, must be processed to understand the level of support that is going to be the level of additional support that's going to be required. This is fundamental in the development of the change of circumstance, because again, if we're providing more support than there's funding available, this is a problem that has to be solved. If you know
Yeah.
what I mean, no one really wants to think about that part, but it is something that has to be considered and has to be dealt with on a step by step. So you need that risk assessment. The third step is obviously the creation of the change of circumstance to submit to the NDIA to get the additional funding. The NDIA must be made aware every time in each of those situations there's an agreement between all parties to provide more support than funding. And this is all about protecting the provider in this situation, because they're the ones that are absorbing all the risk in this situation. And the final step is an agreement from all parties to track the additional support. But this again is fundamental to the development of the change of circumstance, but also fundamental to the shared responsibility between the participant, the guardian, support coordinator, plan manager. The risk assessment is essential, which also is a fundamental underpinning to the change of circumstance. The NDIA must be made aware that more support is being provided than there's funding. Again, this is about protecting the provider, because in these situations, they're the ones that are absorbing all the risk here, because the ultimate outcome will be providing support with zero funding. And this is where providers can very easily get into a position where you're losing 70, 150, 200,000 plus for a house because you're providing support and there's zero funding to support it. And then the last part is there needs to be agreement between all parties for the additional support to be tracked. This again is for evidence for the change of circumstance, but it's also about informing all parties and ensuring there's that shared responsibility around this issue.
That's a really great concept around, yes, they might be living with the SIL provider, but everybody in that, everybody has responsibility around making sure that their needs are being met,
Yes.
and that the funding's in line with the supports.
Correct. And it's a difficult situation, especially for the SIL provider to have in these situations. But that's why having this 5-step process in place that initiates every single time there's a commitment to provide more service helps enable this shared responsibility.
So how does that work in things like sudden hospitalisation or incarceration or any kind of emergencies?
Yeah, so they're two very common situations which catch a lot of providers out. Um, one of our recommendations, and it's something that we have inbuilt into all of our schedules of support, and encourage all providers listening to take the same approach in their schedules of support, which is having a program of support sitting as part of that arrangement. A program of support is effectively a 6-month agreement between the participant and the provider, where they're agreeing that the provider will be providing a specific amount of support regardless of what happens during that period over that 6 months. So it basically locks in that support. Programs of support are very rare within the NDIA. There's only about 2 or 3 different situations that allow for the establishment of a program of support between the provider and the participant. But SIL is one of those, as the NDIA has recognized and acknowledged that this is a common situation. So what that means is when you have a program of support built into your schedule of support, If there is a sudden hospitalisation event and a participant needs to go into hospital for 2 or 3 weeks, you can still claim for the support being provided during that period. And this is a way where it protects the provider. Some people listening to this may think this sounds unfair in terms of what do you mean the provider can claim while the participant's not even in the house. But it's very, very fundamental, because if it wasn't in place, then what would need to happen is that rosters and claiming would need to change. Support workers' shifts would be disrupted,
Mm.
and it's also unfair to the other participants in the house. So the program of support ensures a commitment for all the participants in the house that the consistent amount of support will be delivered. So the program of support ensures fairness to the participants, but also to the support workers as well, because they need consistency in terms of the shifts they're working. And making sure your support workers are happy and have that consistency of service is again fundamental to ensuring the best level of support and care is being provided to the participant.
So you touched there briefly around a program of support
Yep.
inside your schedule of support.
Yep.
Can you explain what a program of support is and why it's different than the schedule of support?
Sure. So the schedule of support or the service agreement is outlining the support that's going to be delivered during the plan period. However, it doesn't cover situations where the participant isn't in the house for the reasons that we talked about. So there's the schedule of support and the service agreement doesn't give the provider protection for the situations that we're talking about. The program of support ensures that there's consistency of the support that's going to be delivered to that house, and ensures that the provider can commit to providing that service and is going to be able to claim for that.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. So we've talked about quite a lot today in regards to service agreements. We've talked about the risks of having poor service agreements. We've talked about the concept of an open service agreement. We've talked about avoiding and resolving those risks. We've talked about providing extra supports and how to manage that, as well as programs of supports and what to do in emergency situations. Is there anything else that providers should know when putting together service agreements in a SIL perspective?
Yeah, so the emergency situation is an important one, along with provider limitations as well. So one thing that we build into our schedules of support and encourage all SIL providers to do is to have 2 sections in their schedule of support around a limitation of the provider responsibility, in terms of they're not responsible for decisions made by the NDIA,
Right.
and and if the funding runs out, well, that's not the provider's responsibility either. Okay. And the reason that's again fundamental is because of this idea of shared responsibility between all parties. The last part we always include within schedules of support is around emergency housing. So the emergency housing section says that if the funding is exhausted, then emergency housing may potentially be sourced for the participant. Now, for anyone listening that's gone through this, understands this is it's a very traumatic process to put the participant through. Adam, our founder's gone through this as a support worker, in terms of having to go through this, which is a very difficult process. No one wants this to happen. And the reason to include this in the agreement isn't about saying, well, funds exhausting, we're moving the participant to hospitalisation, but by no means. But everyone has to understand that this risk is at play. Like, this is a very real reality for all parties, in terms of the provider isn't just a free ride to provide support, regardless of whether there's funding to be whether there's funding there or not.
Yep.
Because there's a business to be worried about, there's support workers to be worried about, And most importantly, there's the participants and all the other houses that need to
Yeah.
be worried about. And so it's very important to include a section on emergency housing, because it just makes all parties aware of what we're actually talking about when we're going to provide more support than there's funding for. And having that in there and people reading that and understanding what's at risk and asking the questions creates that conversation that enables that shared responsibility. We need to work as a team around this participant and make sure that we understand how we actually going to manage this funding as a collective for the best outcome. And what does it mean if we're going to make a decision to exhaust that funding? What's going to happen at the end if the change of circumstance doesn't go through? We can't just hope that more funding is coming.
Yeah.
We have to be realistic at the beginning,
Mm.
because that's what, there's no risk then. When the funding's exhausted and then everyone's in a very difficult situation around providing support or not, it's
Yeah.
too late to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Everyone's
Absolutely.
way too emotive. You need to have the conversation at the beginning
Yeah.
when you're making this decision.
Yeah. That's really great advice. And I think that's something that many people don't think about as well. Yeah. Great. Well, that was really wonderful. I think we covered a lot around service agreements and the risks and linking that back to claiming and profitability. If there is someone listening today who wants to speak to you more about what you do at Resolv, how can they get in touch?
Yep. By all means, reach out to us on the website. If I've talked about some things today where it sounds like problems that you're having, or I'm talking about the schedule of support or program of support and you're not too sure how to include that, please feel free, reach out and have the conversation. This is not advice and guidance that we charge for. So yeah, reach out via the website, reach out via LinkedIn, or anywhere you can find us. We're more than happy to make the time to help you and provide guidance around how to make sure your schedules of support both protect the provider, but then also enable the best outcome for the participant.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Nice. Thanks a lot.
That's a wrap on this episode of SILosophy. If this resonated with you, take a second to subscribe and share it with someone in the SIL space who really needs to hear this. Don't forget to connect with Tania Gomez Consulting on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook for more resources, conversations, and support to help you grow your impact. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep making a difference.